She's just waiting to die so we can sell the house. That was the sentence that changed everything. The words were spoken softly, almost lazily, across a table set with white linen and polished silverware at a small French restaurant in Boston. The candlelight flickered between crystal glasses of red wine, and the smell of butter and roasted garlic drifted through the air. It should have been a beautiful evening. After all, we were there to celebrate my son Daniel and his wife Emily's 10th wedding anniversary. But when I heard those words, spoken in French by Emily's mother, Sophie Laurent, something inside me went very still. The rest of the table continued as if nothing unusual had happened. Sophie lifted her wine glass with elegant fingers. Her husband Jean-Luc leaned back in his chair, nodding slowly. Emily smiled politely while scrolling through something on her phone. Daniel laughed at a joke I hadn't quite caught. No one looked at me. No one seemed worried about what had just been said, because none of them believed I understood a single word. I kept my expression calm and reached for my water glass. The ice clinked softly as I lifted it. Across the table, Sophie continued speaking in French, her voice smooth and conversational. She said it the way someone might comment on the weather, casual and unbothered. Jean-Luc replied with a quiet chuckle, saying that houses in our neighborhood were worth at least $800,000 now, maybe more. Emily leaned closer to her parents, lowering her voice slightly, but not enough. She said Daniel would never agree to sell while I was still living there, but eventually, nature solves these problems. Daniel didn't react because they weren't speaking English. To him, it probably sounded like harmless family chatter. I sat there, nodding politely, cutting a small piece of salmon from my plate. 10 years. For 10 years they had spoken French whenever I was around. At birthdays. At holidays. Even at Thanksgiving dinners in my own dining room. I suppose they thought Americans never bothered learning other languages. And for 10 years I had allowed them to believe that. The waiter passed by to refill our glasses. Soft jazz played somewhere near the bar. Outside the tall windows, a cold Boston wind pushed against the streetlights. Everything looked normal, calm, elegant. Inside my mind, however, a quiet understanding was beginning to settle into place like pieces of a puzzle finally clicking together. This dinner wasn't just a celebration. It was a meeting, a discussion, and the subject of that discussion was me. Sophie continued speaking, now describing the house as old but charming, saying that once it was renovated it could sell quickly. Jean-Luc agreed and suggested that retirement communities near the coast were quite comfortable these days. Emily laughed softly and said she had already looked at a few online. Still no one looked at me. They assumed the conversation was invisible to me, hidden safely behind another language. I placed my fork neatly beside my plate and folded my napkin in my lap. Then I took a slow sip of water and listened. Because when people believe you don't understand them, they tend to reveal far more than they should. The conversation around the table continued as though nothing unusual had happened, and in a way that was exactly the problem. When people believe their words are invisible, they become careless. Sophie leaned slightly closer to Jean-Luc and continued speaking in French, her voice warm and relaxed. She said the neighborhood had become extremely valuable over the past few years, especially since new families were moving into Boston and property prices had climbed steadily. Jean-Luc agreed and mentioned that homes similar to mine were now selling in less than 3 weeks. Emily listened carefully, occasionally glancing toward Daniel, who was busy explaining something about his work to the waiter. Daniel had always been proud of his career. He liked talking about numbers, contracts, and expansion plans. I noticed that Emily nodded whenever he spoke, but her attention quickly drifted back toward her parents the moment the waiter stepped away. Sophie then asked Emily whether Daniel had ever mentioned transferring ownership of the house yet. Emily answered quietly that Daniel still believed the house would remain in the family for sentimental reasons. She said he felt responsible for me since his father passed away 7 years earlier. Jean-Luc gave a soft laugh and replied that time changes everything, especially when large properties require maintenance and taxes increase every year. He said people eventually learn that practicality matters more than nostalgia. I sat there, gently moving a piece of roasted asparagus across my plate while the conversation continued to unfold like a quiet theater performance. 10 years of listening to these voices had taught me the rhythm of their conversations. Sophie spoke with calm authority. Jean-Luc enjoyed sounding wise and worldly. Emily often presented herself as thoughtful and patient, But beneath that softness, there was always calculation. Daniel, unfortunately, rarely noticed these details. He trusted people easily, especially the family he had married into. The waiter returned to refill our water glasses and asked if everything tasted good. Daniel smiled and told him the salmon was excellent. Emily complimented the restaurant as well, saying it felt almost like being in Paris. Sophie responded immediately in French, saying that Boston restaurants tried their best, but they still lacked true French elegance. Jean-Luc nodded again, then added that at least the real estate values made the trip worthwhile. When the waiter walked away, Sophie lowered her voice slightly and asked Emily whether I had considered moving somewhere smaller. Emily said she had gently mentioned the idea once or twice, but Daniel became uncomfortable whenever the subject came up. She explained that Daniel felt it was too soon to discuss changes after his father passed away. Jean-Luc replied that patience solves many problems. Sophie said that eventually age brings its own solutions. I lifted my glass again and took another quiet sip of water. Their words floated across the candlelight with the ease of people discussing simple plans. Retirement communities, renovations, property sales. They spoke as though the house already belonged to them. What fascinated me most was the confidence in their voices. They believed they were planning the future of something that had already been decided. The jazz music from the bar drifted gently across the room, while forks and glasses clicked against plates all around us. Other families laughed. Waiters moved gracefully between tables. To anyone watching, we probably looked like a pleasant family celebrating an anniversary dinner. Yet every sentence spoken in that soft French conversation revealed a little more of what they truly believed about me. And the longer they talked, the clearer the picture became. For a few minutes, the conversation slowed while plates were cleared and a new bottle of wine appeared on the table. Daniel poured a small amount into each glass, smiling the way he always did when he felt proud of organizing something nice for the family. He looked relaxed, unaware that two entirely different conversations were unfolding at the same table. In English, he spoke about work and upcoming travel plans. In French, Emily and her parents continued discussing the future of a house they believed would soon be available. Sophie lifted her glass and examined the deep color of the wine before speaking again. She said the neighborhood was becoming one of the most desirable areas in Boston and that properties with large yards were especially valuable now. Jean-Luc responded that older homes could easily gain $200,000 in value after proper renovation. Emily listened carefully and asked what kind of renovations they would recommend. Jean-Luc described opening the kitchen space, updating the bathrooms, and modernizing the front porch. Sophie added that the garden could become very attractive with a few small changes. They spoke about my home the way architects might study a building they planned to redesign. Calmly, methodically, without once considering the person still living inside it. I gently placed my fork on the edge of my plate and listened to every word. Emily leaned closer toward her parents and lowered her voice slightly. She said Daniel still believed the house belonged to family history, something his father had worked hard to build. Sophie smiled softly and replied that sentiment disappears quickly when financial opportunity appears. Jean-Luc nodded and added that once practical decisions are presented clearly, people often change their minds faster than expected. Emily then said something that made Daniel glance briefly toward her, although he did not understand the words themselves. She explained that Daniel sometimes worried about how I would feel if the subject of selling the house ever came up directly. Sophie responded that older people often resist change at first, but eventually they understand when it is presented as concern for their comfort. She suggested that retirement communities offered wonderful services, peaceful surroundings, and organized social activities. Jean-Luc agreed and said many modern communities looked more like small resorts than assisted living facilities. Emily nodded slowly, clearly considering the idea. Daniel continued talking about work schedules, unaware that the quiet discussion beside him was outlining a future where my presence had already been replaced by renovation plans and real estate listings. The candlelight flickered across the tablecloth while the restaurant hummed softly with conversations from other tables. Forks tapped gently against plates. Glasses clinked as waiters moved gracefully through the room. Everything appeared peaceful from the outside. Yet beneath the calm surface, each French sentence revealed another piece of a plan that had been forming quietly for some time. I had always believed that listening carefully tells you more about people than speaking ever could. That night, surrounded by candlelight and soft music. I realized just how much they had been willing to reveal once they believed their words were safely hidden behind a language they assumed I did not understand. As dessert menus arrived and the waiter began describing the evening specials, I realized something important about the silence I had kept for so many years. Silence is not always weakness. Sometimes it is simply patience. I listened as Sophie complimented the restaurant again in French, saying the chef had done a respectable job with the duck even if it was not quite Paris quality. Jean-Luc nodded with the relaxed confidence of someone who believed he understood the entire situation perfectly. Emily leaned back in her chair and folded her hands together on the table, glancing briefly toward Daniel before continuing the quiet conversation with her parents. She said that Daniel was a good man, but sometimes too sentimental. According to her, he carried a deep sense of loyalty to family traditions, especially anything connected to his father. Sophie responded that this kind of loyalty can be gently redirected if the conversation is handled carefully. She explained that people often accept major life changes when they are presented as concern rather than pressure. Jean-Luc added that the key is timing. He said the right moment usually appears when people begin to feel overwhelmed by responsibilities they did not expect to carry forever. I slowly lifted my fork and took another bite of the chocolate dessert that had just been placed in front of me. The sweetness was rich and smooth, and for a moment the entire room felt strangely calm despite the quiet strategy meeting unfolding across the table. Emily continued speaking in French, explaining that Daniel worried about leaving me alone if the house were ever sold. She said he believed the home represented stability for me after his father passed away. Sophie replied gently that stability can be recreated in many places, especially when the new environment offers organized activities, medical support, and social gatherings designed for older residents. Jean-Luc added that modern retirement communities are beautifully designed, often located near the ocean or quiet parks. He described walking paths, community dining rooms, and transportation services. Listening to him, one might almost believe they were planning a pleasant vacation rather than discussing the removal of someone from the life she had built for decades. Daniel finally paused in his conversation about work and looked around the table with a cheerful expression. He asked if everyone was enjoying the evening and thanked Emily's parents again for flying in from Montreal for the anniversary celebration. Sophie switched immediately back to English and smiled warmly at him, telling him it had been a lovely dinner. Jean-Luc agreed, saying it was wonderful to see family gathered together. Their tone changed so smoothly that it would have been impossible for anyone who did not understand French to detect the difference between the two conversations. I folded my napkin neatly beside my plate and watched the candlelight reflect in the glasses across the table. For 10 years I had allowed these quiet French conversations to pass without comment. 10 years of listening while they assumed their words were invisible to me. But the more they spoke tonight, the clearer their plan became. And the clearer their plan became, the more certain I felt that patience had given me something far more valuable than anger ever could. It had given me knowledge. And knowledge, I had learned long ago, is the most powerful advantage anyone can carry into a conversation that others believe they control. For a while the conversation drifted back to lighter subjects. Daniel spoke about a project his company was expanding into Chicago, explaining how the team expected the first phase to take at least 18 months. Emily listened politely, resting her chin lightly against her hand, but every few minutes her attention returned to her parents. The rhythm of the evening had become almost predictable. English for Daniel, French for the real discussion. Sophie waited until Daniel turned his head to thank the waiter again before she spoke quietly to Emily. She said that opportunities rarely wait forever and that real estate markets change quickly. Jean-Luc agreed and added that the current demand in Boston meant the house could attract several buyers within days if it were presented properly. Emily asked whether they believed it would truly sell that quickly. Jean-Luc answered with quiet confidence that location alone made the property valuable. Sophie then mentioned something that made my fingers pause slightly against the edge of my napkin. She said the house carried emotional meaning for Daniel, but emotions fade when practical concerns begin to grow. She explained that taxes on older properties often increase over time, and maintenance becomes difficult for someone living alone. Emily nodded slowly and said Daniel often worried about whether the roof might eventually need repairs or whether the heating system would require replacement during the winter. Sophie responded that those kinds of concerns could easily become part of a careful conversation about comfort and safety. Jean-Luc added that presenting the idea as a way to protect me from future stress would make it easier for Daniel to accept the change. Listening to them, I realized that this discussion had clearly taken place before tonight. Their words carried the calm confidence of people continuing a plan rather than inventing one. Emily glanced toward Daniel again and lowered her voice even further. She said that once the house was sold, Daniel would finally feel free to focus on their own future plans. Sophie smiled softly and replied that young couples deserve the chance to build their own lives without unnecessary obligations holding them back. Jean-Luc then spoke about renovation budgets and suggested that even modest updates could increase the selling price by at least $100,000. The numbers floated easily through the conversation as though they were discussing a piece of property already sitting empty. I folded my hands gently on the table and looked at the candle between us. Its flame moved slightly each time someone shifted in their chair. Around us, the restaurant remained warm and comfortable, filled with quiet laughter and the soft clinking of glasses. From a distance, our table probably looked like a peaceful family enjoying dessert together. Yet every French sentence carried another small detail of the future they imagined. A future where the house would belong to them. A future where my life would be quietly moved somewhere else. I lifted my water glass again and took a slow sip, allowing the coolness to settle my thoughts. For 10 years I had allowed them to believe I understood nothing they said. Tonight they had given me something far more valuable than they realized. They had given me the entire outline of their plan. And the most interesting part of that realization was not the plan itself. It was the certainty in their voices that they believed the outcome had already been decided. Jean-Luc was the one who said it next, and the calm certainty in his voice made the meaning impossible to misunderstand. He leaned slightly forward and spoke to Sophie in French, explaining that the best approach would be to introduce the idea gradually over the next year. According to him, large decisions rarely succeed when they appear suddenly. He believed Daniel needed time to feel that the change was his own idea. Sophie agreed immediately. She said that once Daniel began to worry about maintenance costs or property taxes, the conversation could naturally shift toward finding a more comfortable place for me to live. Emily listened carefully to both of them, her eyes thoughtful as she considered each suggestion. Then she said something that made the candlelight seem to pause for a moment between us. She said Daniel still believed the house belonged to family history, something his father had built with pride. She explained that Daniel often said the house carried memories that could not be replaced. Sophie smiled with quiet patience and replied that memories live in people, not in buildings. Jean-Luc added that sentiment often fades when practical concerns appear. He explained that once Daniel begins thinking about the financial possibilities, it will be easier for him to imagine a different future for the property. Emily asked what they believed the house could realistically sell for. Jean-Luc estimated that with minor renovations it could reach nearly $900,000, perhaps more if the market continued its current pace. Sophie nodded and said that such an amount would allow Daniel and Emily to upgrade to a larger home closer to the city. Listening to them, it became clear that the house was not simply a building in their minds. It was a stepping stone toward a different life they had already begun to imagine. Daniel finished the last sip of his wine and leaned back in his chair with a satisfied smile, clearly pleased that everyone seemed to be enjoying the evening. He thanked Emily's parents again for traveling all the way from Montreal for the celebration. Sophie responded warmly in English, telling him the evening had been delightful. Jean-Luc agreed and complimented the restaurant once more. The transition between languages was so smooth that Daniel never noticed the difference between their public conversation and their private one. I watched the candlelight reflect softly in the polished silverware while the waiter approached to ask whether anyone would like coffee. Daniel ordered an espresso. Emily chose tea. Sophie and Jean-Luc both requested coffee as well. When the waiter stepped away, Sophie leaned slightly toward Emily again and spoke quietly in French. She said the most important step would be convincing Daniel that moving me somewhere smaller would improve my quality of life. She described retirement communities with walking paths, organized activities, and neighbors my own age. Jean-Luc added that once Daniel begins believing the change is meant to help me, the rest of the process will become easy. Emily listened with a thoughtful expression and slowly nodded in agreement. I sat quietly, my hands resting lightly on the tablecloth, while the full shape of their plan became clearer with every sentence. They believed they were discussing the future of a house. What they did not realize was that they had just revealed the future they expected for me. And the more they spoke with such calm confidence, the more certain I became that patience had given me something they did not expect me to have. Time. And time, I had learned long ago, allows a person to choose the exact moment when silence finally ends. I let them finish. That was the most important decision I made that evening. Instead of interrupting or reacting too soon, I simply continued listening while the waiter returned with coffee and tea. Small porcelain cups were placed gently on the table, and the rich aroma of espresso filled the air. Daniel thanked the waiter again and lifted his cup with a relaxed smile, completely unaware of the second conversation that had quietly unfolded beside him all night. Emily stirred her tea slowly, the small spoon touching the porcelain with a soft, rhythmic sound. Sophie leaned slightly toward her daughter and continued speaking in French, her voice calm and confident. She said that the most important part of any plan is patience, because people rarely accept change when they feel forced into it. Jean-Luc agreed and added that Daniel would eventually see the financial logic once the conversation was presented carefully. Emily nodded and said that Daniel always tried to do the responsible thing, especially when it came to family. Sophie smiled and replied that responsibility can sometimes guide people exactly where they need to go. Jean-Luc then mentioned that the real estate market in Boston was moving faster every month, and waiting too long might mean losing a valuable opportunity. Emily said she understood and that she would begin planting the idea gradually. She explained that Daniel had recently been worried about winter heating costs and property maintenance. Sophie responded that those concerns could easily become the starting point for a thoughtful conversation. Jean-Luc added that once Daniel begins imagining a future without those burdens, the rest of the plan will feel natural to him. I listened quietly while the pieces of their strategy settled into place with remarkable clarity. They believed they were having a private planning session, carefully shaping a future where my house would become their opportunity. The candlelight reflected softly in their glasses while they spoke, and for a moment I wondered if they had ever considered the possibility that the person sitting quietly across from them might understand every word. Daniel took another sip of his espresso and turned toward me with a friendly expression. He asked if I was enjoying the dessert and whether the restaurant reminded me of the small cafes we used to visit during family trips years ago. I smiled gently and told him the evening had been very pleasant. Emily looked at me briefly, then returned her attention to her parents. Sophie continued speaking in French, explaining that timing would be essential and that the conversation about moving should begin within the next few months. Jean-Luc nodded again and said that once the first step is taken, the rest will follow naturally. I folded my hands together on the table and watched the candle flame move softly between us. They had spent the entire evening explaining their plan with calm confidence, certain that their words were hidden behind a language barrier. What they did not realize was that the plan they had so carefully outlined had given me something far more valuable than they intended. It had given me complete clarity about what they expected to happen next. And when you understand exactly what someone believes the future will look like, you gain a remarkable advantage. Because the moment you finally choose to speak, you are no longer reacting to their plan. You are revealing that you have understood it all along. For a moment, the table grew quieter as everyone finished their coffee. The waiter passed once more to clear the plates, and the gentle clinking of porcelain echoed softly in the warm dining room. Around us, the restaurant continued its quiet rhythm, couples talking, glasses touching lightly, the soft music drifting through the air like a steady heartbeat. Daniel leaned back in his chair with a satisfied expression, clearly pleased with how the evening had gone. He thanked everyone again for coming and said that it meant a lot to celebrate 10 years of marriage surrounded by family. Emily smiled warmly at him, placing her hand lightly on his arm. Sophie and Jean-Luc both nodded approvingly, their faces calm and gracious in the candlelight. To anyone watching, the evening looked perfect. Yet I knew something the others believed was impossible. I knew every word that had been spoken in French throughout the entire dinner. Sophie lifted her coffee cup and spoke quietly to Emily again, still believing her words were hidden behind a language Daniel and I could not understand. She said that tonight had been a good opportunity to observe how Daniel responded to certain topics. Jean-Luc agreed and suggested that the next conversation should happen soon, before the winter heating bills arrived. Emily nodded slowly, saying she would find the right moment. She said Daniel trusted her judgment, and that trust made the situation easier. I let them finish the sentence. Then I reached for my napkin and folded it carefully beside my plate. The movement was small, but it drew a brief glance from Daniel. I lifted my eyes towards Sophie and Jean-Luc and spoke for the first time in several minutes. But I did not speak in English. I spoke in French. I thanked them politely for their thoughtful discussion about the future of my home. The words left my mouth calmly, without anger, spoken with the same steady tone they had used throughout the evening. For a moment, the entire table froze. Sophie's hand stopped halfway between the table and her cup. Jean-Luc blinked slowly as if he had misheard something impossible. Emily's eyes widened before she could hide the reaction. Daniel looked from one face to another, clearly confused by the sudden silence. I continued speaking in French, repeating several of the points they had made earlier in the evening. I mentioned the renovation plans Jean-Luc had described. I mentioned the comfortable retirement communities Sophie had recommended. I even repeated the estimate they had suggested for selling the house once the market was right. Each sentence landed gently on the table, like a quiet bell ringing in an empty room. Daniel finally leaned forward, looking completely bewildered. He asked why everyone had suddenly stopped talking. I turned my attention toward him and smiled softly. Then I explained in English that his wife's parents had been having a very detailed conversation all evening about what they believed would happen to my house. The candlelight flickered between us as the meaning of the moment slowly settled across the table. For 10 years, they had believed their language protected their plans from being heard. What they had never considered was that sometimes the quiet person at the table is not silent because she does not understand. Sometimes she is silent because she is waiting for the right moment to let everyone else finish revealing exactly what they believe. For several seconds, no one at the table moved. The soft music from the restaurant continued drifting through the air, but our small circle had fallen completely silent. Sophie slowly placed her coffee cup back onto the saucer, her expression carefully controlled, although the color in her face had faded slightly. Jean-Luc looked at me with the same calm posture he had held all evening, yet the confidence that had filled his voice earlier was no longer there. Emily lowered her eyes toward the tablecloth, her fingers tightening around the handle of her teacup. Daniel looked between all of us, clearly trying to understand how a quiet anniversary dinner had suddenly turned into something he had not expected. I kept my voice gentle and steady. I explained that I had studied French many years ago when my late husband accepted a temporary assignment in Paris. We had lived there for almost 5 years. During that time, I had taught language classes at a small community center and spent my afternoons speaking French with neighbors who quickly became friends. Learning a language changes the way you listen to the world. It also teaches you something else that is even more important. It teaches you that people often reveal their true thoughts when they believe they are speaking privately. Daniel's expression slowly shifted from confusion to realization as my words settled in. He looked toward Emily, then toward her parents. None of them spoke. The candlelight flickered softly between us while the rest of the restaurant continued its comfortable evening without noticing anything unusual at our table. I smiled gently and continued speaking. I told Daniel that his wife's parents had spent much of the evening discussing what they believed would happen to the house after I moved somewhere smaller. I mentioned the renovations Jean-Luc had described, the property value estimates he had calculated, and the retirement communities Sophie had recommended so carefully. Each detail had been shared openly throughout the dinner, simply in another language. Daniel turned slowly toward Emily, his expression serious but calm. Emily finally lifted her eyes, looking uncertain for the first time that evening. Sophie cleared her throat softly and began to say something in English, explaining that perhaps there had been a misunderstanding. I raised my hand gently, not in anger, but simply to pause the moment. Then I spoke once more, this time with the same calm tone that had guided the entire evening. I explained that there was one small detail they had not considered while planning the future of my home. The house they had been discussing did not belong to Daniel. It did not belong to Emily either. Many years earlier, shortly after my husband passed away, I had placed the property into a family trust. The decision had been made quietly with the help of our attorney to ensure that the house would always remain under my control for as long as I chose to live there. Daniel blinked in surprise. Emily's parents exchanged a brief glance with one another. I finished my coffee and placed the cup gently on the table. Then I smiled again, not with bitterness, but with quiet certainty. I explained that sometimes people make plans based on assumptions. And sometimes the quiet person at the table knows far more about the situation than anyone else realizes.